I was just thinking about it that 2 years ago exactly. Today is May 1st, happy May 1st. But May 2nd, I was interviewing for this job in this room. And we were wearing masks. So I'm so glad to see a full room now with no masks. So thank you, Dr. Lambordazzi, for inviting us to open this excellent symposium or roundtables, if you will. Nature-based climate solutions, innovations in climate solutions. So before I came here, I used to teach a course on planetary health and conservation medicine. And just thinking about nature-based solutions and how the term spun up for a few years ago. If you think about it, it's a term that just comes from many ways we've been managing the planet and land and species. We require indigenous science, really, that been applying nature-based solutions for centuries, really. And so thank you for being here for the conversation. And here at Warner College, we just released our strategic plan. I got a few copies of the short versions for those that don't have it. I left them on the panelist table. But nature-based solutions is mentioned there in one of our goals. So I think it's time for this call of action. And I think this panel is going to be very useful to look at tackling the roots of causes of nature deterioration, climate change, biodiversity loss, replicate and scale successful policies and projects. And Warner College is highly qualified to do that across our departments, centers, and all the institutes and programs. We need to evolve our economic and financial systems. As you know, we're going through critical time in changing those and trying to navigate a sustainable future with positive change for people and nature. So I'll stay here as long as I can for this symposium, but I want to thank you and the panelists, Susan Cook-Patton, or Patton, very good. Sarah Federman, Matt Ramlow on the screen, and the Departments of Ecosystem Science and Sustainability and Forest and Rangeland Stewardship, and both departments are here. Department heads are here, Eric Thoman and Rich Conant. So thank you for organizing this important event. And I'd like to introduce now our moderator for this afternoon, ESS faculty, Danica Lambordazzi. Thank you.
First thing I'm going to do is take that funny thing off of Matt's face. So yes, I'm Danica Lambordazzi. I'm a new assistant professor in ecosystem science and sustainability. And I'm very excited today for this panel. There's an urgent need to address the challenges of climate change, as we all know, and I think that that's the reason that many of us are here. The impacts, such as rising global temperatures, extreme events, ecosystem degradation, are increasingly evident, and we really need proactive and collaborative action to be able to tackle these challenges. So nature-based climate solutions, which is the topic of this panel, can reduce atmospheric carbon dioxide, and they can help with climate change mitigation when coupled with drastic emissions reductions. So we can harness the power of nature to sequester carbon and to mitigate climate change and enhance ecosystem services. So this panel discussion will look at the multifaceted dimensions of nature-based climate solutions. And we'll touch on topics like opportunities to scale these solutions, considerations of equity, and complementarity and tensions with other mitigation and adaptation strategies. So before we dive into our questions, I would like to introduce our panel. Dr. Sarah Federman, who is sitting on the end, has a bachelor's degree from Barnard College. She has a master's and PhD from Yale University, and she is the director of Carbon Direct's Landscape Decarbonization team. She works with clients to build equitable and rigorous decarbonization strategies focused on ecological resilience, biodiversity, and agricultural sustainability. She was a lead author and coordinator of a federal research and development policy for landscape resiliency, agricultural innovation, and circular carbon economy during her time as a AAAS fellowship before joining Carbon Direct. Dr. Susan Cook-Patton, who is sitting in the middle, received her bachelor's degree from Indiana University and her PhD from Cornell University. She is the senior forest restoration scientist at the Nature Conservancy, which she joined in 2016. Susan works to quantify the climate mitigation potential of reforestation. And prior to joining the Nature Conservancy, she worked with the U.S. Forest Service and the Smithsonian Institution, and she shares her work with the public through videos, public lectures, and major news outlets. Dr. Matt Ramlow got his bachelor's degree from Yale University and his PhD from here at Colorado State University. He is a research associate in the World Resource Institute's climate program, which he joined in 2019. He develops guidance for quantifying greenhouse gas emissions and carbon removals from land use change, forestry, bioenergy, and carbon capture. And prior to joining WRI, he led capacity building workshops to supporting the national greenhouse gas inventories with the Coalition for Rainforest Nations. So thank you to all of our wonderful panelists for being here. We can also take questions from the audience as we have them, but I will get started with our first question, which I will, I guess I will address to Susan first. Susan, what is a nature-based climate project? Who designs them and who implements them?
Great. Yeah. And did you want me to introduce myself?
Oh yeah, I'm so sorry. I forgot that I was going to ask each panelist to introduce themselves and their current work and their motivation for working in this field. I'm so sorry, I forgot that. Thank you for your reminder. Susan, would you like to start?
Okay, I'll do that first, and we'll do the round, and then I'll.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for giving me a chance to speak with you today. I am a senior forest restoration scientist at the Nature Conservancy. Though I should say, because I am never quite sure what will come out of my mouth, that I speak for myself and not for the Nature Conservancy writ large. But when I joined TNC, it was right when the Griscom et al. 2017 paper, Natural Climate Solutions, came out. And that was an attempt to quantify all the different ways you could work with nature to tackle climate change. And the big take home was that nature could be a third of the solution towards keeping us below 2 degrees warming. And among all the natural climate solutions, reforestation was the biggest bar, the biggest opportunity. But even larger uncertainty around that estimate. And so that was why they brought me in to try to figure out how much carbon can we actually get from restoring tree cover across the globe, and how does that differ depending on where you are and what you do. So a lot of my work involves getting improved estimates of how much carbon removal is possible, as well as developing maps of where you might potentially put trees back. And we do everything from natural forest regrowth to plantations to agroforestry. But I'm on a team that works more broadly across the natural climate solutions space. So I'm happy to talk. I'll probably give mostly reforestation examples, but more broadly.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah. Thanks so much for having me today. Thanks, Donica, for the invitation and for moderating. I apologize. I am not going to be the best speaker today, clearly. But what I do is I'm also a forest ecologist by training. So most of my examples will also trend towards reforestation and maybe some improved forest management. At Carbon Direct, I work with clients, usually large corporations, to help them action their climate plans in ways that are climate smart and in ways that we hope have real climate impact. So a lot of this involves helping them to evaluate carbon projects that they're thinking of investing in order to offset residual emissions. Because as Donica indicated in her opening remarks, we always recommend that we start with reductions when we're thinking about developing a carbon management plan, and that we move to carbon removals and offsets once we can no longer mitigate within our own value chains or within our own operations. So we come in at that point to help clients try to make sure that their investments have real climate impact. Over to you.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for inviting me to the panel today. Sorry I can't be there in person, but glad to be at least speaking back with everyone at CSU. So again, my background, I kind of got my start working within voluntary carbon markets for one of the standards, the verified carbon standard, Spent time at CSU where I got to work with all the great staff there to learn more about some of the different greenhouse gas mitigation practices and methods, models that we can use to quantify both agricultural greenhouse gas emission reductions as well as in forestry systems. And then supported developing countries with some of their policy. But now I work primarily with companies trying to understand their footprint, both in their own operations, if they're a forestry company, or in their value chain for all the agricultural commodity consumers out there. And I would say the motivation for me working in this field is trying to find places where there's actually opportunities on the ground and trying to drive incentives to the right practices. So thinking about how these different types of policy frameworks can incentivize action to take place on the ground and make sure that the producers are informed and aware of different practices that can help reduce their emissions. So in a lot of my work that I do currently with Greenhouse Gas Protocol, it's helping companies understand their footprint and develop methods so that they can quantify all of the greenhouse gas emissions associated with land use change, land management, and other impacts within food systems. So look forward to the panel discussion with everyone else today.
Wonderful, thank you. And thanks, Susan, for that reminder. This is really wonderful introductions. So I guess getting started with our first question, what is a nature-based climate project? Who designs them and who implements them?
Right, so we actually just had a paper that came out, Ellis et al., called The Principles of Natural Climate Solutions, which I can share with anyone that's interested. But we wrote it because, so back in 2017, the term natural climate solution didn't actually exist, if you could put it. But then the Griscom et al. Paper came out and now it's become very common. Slightly different definition from nature-based climate solutions. I'm not gonna bore you with terminology distinctions, but if you also want to talk about that, I'm happy to. The principles that we put forward for natural climate solutions are that they have to be nature-based. So these are activities that are at least maintaining, if not shifting back towards the natural state. So putting a bunch of trees in native grasslands for a plantation would not count as a natural climate solution because you're shifting it away from the native state, which was the natural grassland. They have to be sustainable, right? So they have to address things like leakage and the need that the world has for timber production and food production, right? We can't just pack our croplands full of trees and expect that to work. The world needs food. They have to be climate additional. So protecting a forest that's not threatened is great for lots of reasons, but not a climate mitigation reason because that forest was unlikely to be disturbed. They also have to be measurable. So there's a lot of proposed nature-based solutions that we just don't have a good way of actually quantifying whether they're producing the benefit. So those don't yet count as natural climate solutions, but maybe they're sort of in the wings. And then there's the fifth principle is equitable. That's why I did 5. That I guess this gets to the second part of your question. If a nature-based solution for climate doesn't involve the local community, it's unlikely to persist. They need to be involved in both the design, the implementation, and the benefit sharing of that project. I feel like there was a third part to your who does it?
Who designs and who implements?
Oh, I mean, there's an entire universe of actors that are implementing, from governments to corporations, NGOs, local communities. There's a lot of people that are working to expand nature-based solutions.
Sarah or Matt,
I think that was a really good overview. I think the only things I might kind of supplement that commentary with is that, they need to be measurable, and they also need to be verifiable. So, when we're thinking about this in the context of a voluntary market, we want to see that a project can have a third party come in and kind of verify that these activities are really happening, and then publish that report. And then I think, we'll get into a lot of these equity discussions later in the panel. But I think kind of differentiating between what is good for communities and what is good for ecosystem services is sometimes very difficult and does require a distinction. So we often try to kind of toe that line as well, and make sure that both things are true, although they can sometimes be in conflict.
Yeah, and maybe just building on some of what was said. I mean, I certainly appreciate Susan's comment about the different terminology out there. And for me, a lot of times when I hear nature-based solutions, it's in the context of specific projects, and specifically in order to generate greenhouse gas credits associated with emission reductions or removals that can then, often are traded within voluntary carbon markets, either registered through one of the various voluntary carbon standards and registries out there, or sometimes direct business-to-business types of transactions. But I think there's also a kind of more inclusive definition that you could think of different practices that reduce greenhouse gas emissions or increase sequestration within natural systems, which could be outside of that project crediting framework, which could include broader national policies to encourage, nature-based practices, or more of the space where I work in, which is looking at more of how do you quantify the greenhouse gas impacts of commodities that are sold into value chains, and track that within corporate systems. So just kind of wanted to recognize the different frameworks and incentive frameworks that are out there to encourage these types of mitigation practices on the ground, just to maybe add to some of the earlier comments.
Wonderful. Thank you for that introduction to nature-based climate projects and how we think about them. I think that gives us a broad overview. Susan, you also touched on considering equity, and so I'm curious. Maybe I'll actually address this question to Sarah. What are the equity considerations of nature-based climate solutions, and how can we ensure that they benefit marginalized and vulnerable communities?
So that's a big topic. I'm gonna try my best. And I think, before I dive in, I want to clarify that I am a forest ecologist, and this is not my field of scholarship. And I think it's really important for us to recognize when we're thinking about developing these projects and engaging with these solutions, that it's a multifaceted endeavor that requires many ways of knowing and many forms of expertise. So, knowing what you don't know, or trying to know what you don't know, and then bringing in those complementary skill sets to put together a holistically viable and useful project is the best place to start with answering these questions. I'm looking at Lauren Gifford back there, who I work with a lot and who is an expert in these topics. I always kind of go to with questions. But generally, when we're thinking about a nature-based or any project, and we want to look at it through this lens, we first start by asking the question, have communities been consulted? Has there been stakeholder mapping? Do we even know who the stakeholders are that would be touched by these project activities? Are they aware of the project? Have they bought into it? And then, once we understand, the spectrum of involvement, we might call this kind of procedural justice or procedural equity. How are benefits being distributed? It could be monetary, it could be training, it could be some sort of in-kind contribution, but what does the benefit sharing look like? What is the distributive justice framework that the project is using? And then we kind of go out from there. I feel like there was more to the question that I'm not answering.
I think that starts to get at it, but how can we ensure that they benefit marginalized and vulnerable communities was the second.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, we can't always. I think, starting with that framework where we do that stakeholder mapping and we try to ensure that benefits distribution is equitable and that, that these stakeholders have had a say in which benefits are important to them and how that distribution should occur. Starting point. But, these projects are not always designed, and I'm speaking from the frame of the voluntary market, which is what I know best. These projects are not always designed with marginalized communities in mind, although many of the best ones do have that lens and that framing. So I think if that is a priority for a buyer, that really narrows the aperture of what is out there. And I'd love to see more of it. in this space. I don't know, Susan or Matt, if you have any other comments.
Matt, you can go.
Yeah, I can go next. I think the one thing that I've seen a lot is inequitable access to information about the types of programs that are out there. That can often be a concern where many of these land managers and smallholders and other groups on the ground are not fully informed about some of the broader systems that are providing some of the at least financial benefits. So that's one that we've seen over time through processes like the UN Red process and other UN reporting, is trying to encourage more understanding of benefit sharing agreements between countries and some of the individual projects on the ground. Some of the more advanced countries are further along this path of helping to inform and clarify how benefits get transferred down to the ground level, but in many cases that's not the case. So I think that's one area that I'd highlight for improvement, is just increasing knowledge and awareness and increased price transparency around things like carbon prices and things when it comes to credits and projects.
And I'll build on that, though. I guess there's a question.
I was going to ask if you could pass the microphone around.
Sure.
People are speaking, it's hard to hear back
Okay.
here.
Okay,
Maybe you
great.
could turn up the speaker. That would be helpful as well.
Thank you. How is this? Is that better? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, better, but if there's a speaker volume, that can be turned up too.
Oh, in the system for the room, you mean?
I'll talk loudly while that's happening.
Go ahead.
Okay. I'm not shouting, but I am shouting. So this is something that I worry about a lot, because I firmly believe that effective natural climate solutions hinge upon effective engagements with the local communities and making sure that they're equitable. One of the nice things about working at the Nature Conservancy is we are based in a lot of different countries, and the field programs are very interconnected with the local NGOs and the local communities. So, wow, this is very loud. So even though, I work from a desk primarily in Washington, D.C., I can at least lean on my colleagues to make sure that they are fully connected with the communities. But what we've done is, to build on Matt's point, we've built a platform called NatureBase, which is intended to, you can draw a polygon on a map and it tells you how much mitigation potential you can get for a specific action in that area. And the reason we did that was an attempt to try to democratize access to information. So anyone who has connection to an internet can get that information, but I recognize that that is not enough, right? We need to go further to actually get information to the hands of the local communities. And to build on what Sarah said, I think there's the right process that we need to follow. And we've built what we call a human rights tool that you can sort of go through, and it'll flag issues that you might want to consider. And so have you done the right process? But then we also need follow-up to see what is actually happening. We did a survey of all tropical tree planting organizations and found that over 1 billion trees have been planted since the 1960s. It's a lot of trees, and only 18% of the organizations actually mention monitoring, and only 5% mention survival, right? So we're just putting trees in the ground and we're not measuring to see whether they survive. And we're definitely not going out and interviewing the local communities and saying, did this work for you? And there are examples of where people have planted the wrong trees that exacerbated water situations for that local community. So I think we need a lot more of that work to ensure that each subsequent project stands on the shoulders of those that came before, so that we're pushing for greater equity as we go on.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for your comments and thoughts. Switching gears just a little bit, Matt, I would like to address this next question to you to start. What are the key challenges and barriers to implementing nature-based climate solutions at scale, and how can we address them?
Yes, I think that there's a number of different barriers that we see to adoption of nature-based climate solutions, and obviously that can vary quite a bit depending on the type of land use, the geography, et cetera, that you're talking about. But broadly speaking, I think we can, categorize them into some different types of systems. So sometimes there are, financial barriers that would prevent adoptions of certain practices. So if we think in a agricultural context, it might require financing for new equipment to implement no-till practices. But there could also be other barriers, such as cultural barriers around the types of practices. Getting farmers to adopt more cover crops or diversified rotations within their cropping systems. And many times that can be less of yes, finances play a role in that, but some of that is practices within those regions in order to adopt practices that can help reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So I would say that while many times making sure that there are policies and programs that can deliver the sort of financial incentives that are necessary to be able to implement these types of projects, it's also important to think about some of these other barriers to changes in practice that can lead to greenhouse gas mitigation opportunities. And then I would say the other one that can be a really important one to address is also barriers and access to information, and to really understand the impacts of practices. So I certainly appreciate some of the work that Susan and others are doing to build these types of systems. I know within WRI, I have colleagues that work on a platform, the Land and Carbon Lab, where they're also trying to provide similar access to information on carbon stocks and different land uses that can help give individuals more access to this type of information, so that they can really understand what the impacts of different practices can be.
Is Matt loud enough in the back of the room at all? That's not. Okay, sorry about that. We'll try to switch it up really quick. If you can bear with us.
All right, can you all hear me? No,
So
all
we
right.
might have to pause just briefly in order to do that.
Matt, do you want to say something quickly?
Yeah, can you hear me better in the room, or it's muted? I can't hear the room right now, but.
Yes.
Does this work? Katie,
Yeah,
if you can hear
I was
yourself.
hearing feedback in the room, but I don't know if maybe others can proceed in the panel for now, or.
Okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
All right, we'll try this and hope that it doesn't echo. Can you hear us now, Matt?
I can hear you now, yeah, if you can.
Okay, great. Perfect. That'll work.
Okay, can you all hear me? Great. Well, I really like the framing that Matt gave with kind of thinking about financial barriers and then cultural and data-driven barriers as well. And I think this is a space where all of the kind of quality criteria that Susan laid out at the start really start to intersect in interesting ways. Because if you don't have that cultural buy-in, for example, or that deep understanding of the science and why it might benefit the landscape that you're stewarding from both a climate perspective, but also maybe for the long-term financial gains perspective, you're not going to have durable uptake of these practice changes. And durability is something that we talk about a lot in carbon projects because, we don't. And this comes back to that follow-up conversation we were having when we were talking about equity. It's not enough to set it and then let it sit. You need to follow up. You need to make sure that these practices are still being maintained through time, because we can only assume that the carbon is being stored on the landscape for as long as these practices are occurring. So having that buy-in and making sure that incentives are aligned throughout project design all the way through to how benefits are distributed is essential to making sure that these are viable in the long term and not just at initiation.
And those were two excellent responses. So I guess I won't repeat what they've said, but just point out that there's various levels. There are levers at different levels and they're different levers. So if you're thinking at the level of the person on the land, you need to make sure you are finding a solution that works for them, that helps them maintain their livelihood, improves their livelihood ideally. But then, at the national level, it could be changing policies. We have a lot of policies around the world that actually work against the deployment of nature-based solutions for climate. And if we can change policies, then we potentially have a very large lever to pull there. But also then within the corporate sector, you can think about the actual value chain. Can you work within that value chain? And can there be pressure from the people, the customers that are buying that product that could help drive more adoption of natural climate solutions? So there's many barriers. When I saw that question, I was like, oh my gosh, so many barriers, but there's lots of potential solutions as well.
Okay. Not doing that.
This is what adaptability is all about. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for all of your patience with the sound issues and for also alerting us to the fact that you couldn't hear. Yeah, I'm just gonna not use that mic, so we'll keep passing the mic. Thank you all for the, again, thoughtful responses and highlighting the many barriers and also solutions that we have to scaling natural climate solutions. I'm curious next, how do natural climate solutions intersect with other climate adaptation and mitigation strategies such as renewable energy development and sustainable land use planning? Are there clear points of complementarity? What are the points of tension? Susan, maybe I'll let you get started with this.
Right, so climate mitigation is about tackling climate change, keeping it from happening. Climate adaptation is about figuring out how we can live with climate change. And I used to just work on climate mitigation because we were trying to stop climate change from happening. But I think as we've seen, the effects are here and now. And so we really need to think about how we can both mitigate and adapt simultaneously. It's possible to achieve both, but not always. So for example, again, reforestation examples. If you're thinking about urban tree planting, that's not going to capture a lot of carbon because there's only so many trees you can pack in a city. But you can have additional benefits, adaptation benefits from the cooling that it provides, as well as some buffering in the winter as well. And that can reduce energy consumption. So it does potentially do a little bit of both. Another place where this is played is thinking about where to deploy reforestation. So we've done this work that you can see the Reforestation Hub, which is meant to provide a menu of all the different places you can restore trees across the US. And we are now working with our renewable energy team where they have this site renewables right. So the goal is we need to massively scale up renewable energy that also has a large footprint. Can we figure out how to minimize the impact or the conflict between reforestation and renewable deployment? So for example, minelands, people talk about potentially reforesting minelands. You can do that, it's quite hard to do. Maybe that would be a site that would be better used for something like solar panel arrays than reforestation. So I think it's just sort of the point that Matt keeps making, like trying to provide additional information so people can make good decisions about, you know, what do they want to do here? What are the trade-offs and outcomes of those actions across all the many metrics that you're trying to optimize against?
Sure, yeah.
So I fully agree with those comments. I think it's important, you know, climate change is here, and the solutions need to be a yes and approach. You know, there's not going to be one silver bullet solution. So we can't just rely on natural climate solutions, and we can't just rely on renewable energy or reductions. We need to bundle them all together. So taking a step back, using that 1,000-foot view to say where should these things be deployed for maximum effect is, I think, a really good approach. I think also more on a more granular level, when we're designing these natural climate solutions projects, thinking about adaptation in the long term, because again, we want these to be long-term solutions, and thinking about our principles of adaptation kind of embedded in project design and are we drawing from that scholarship is equally important. So if we were to take a reforestation example, are you reforesting with locally adapted seed, but are you also thinking about future climate conditions when you're thinking about your seed sources and your germplasm? So like, and how you kind of deploy those across your landscape is quite important.
Yeah, Matt, if you would like to add.
Yeah, I think the way that I tend to view, and I will first say that I think this question, there's a lot of different ways that you can kind of tackle this and how you could think about the relationships between you know, nature-based solutions and other climate mitigation strategies, especially adaptation. But I tend to view it from the view that many of my colleagues at WRI who've produced the Sustainable Futures Report view it looking at three major global gaps that we have right now. So we have a food gap between sort of what we project the global demand for calories is in 2050 and what we're currently producing or able to produce. So we know that we have a lot of work to do to increase yields and to be able to meet that demand. Thinking about the land gap of, you know, the area that's required in order to produce that food that we need, but also manage it for other, you know, food, fiber, et cetera. Where if we think about the managed land, you know, estimates are anywhere from 70 to 75% of, you know, global land areas being used within managed systems, which really only leaves the remainder of 30% or so to revert back to nature. So it's really about how do we create optimized land use that is able to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also, you know, produce and deliver on these essential goals so that we can achieve our climate goals, but also ensure that we're meeting other critical gaps when it comes to food production and other things. And I think when you're thinking about that, also identifying those practices that are not only able to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also, you know, build resilient agricultural systems and be able to adapt to the changing climate and the, you know, different conditions that we can anticipate and that we're already seeing around the world. So I know that's a very high level answer to a very broad question, but hopefully that gives a little bit more context to that.
So I guess building on this into, I'm gonna wrap up with one final question to leave time for questions in the room. How do we evaluate the co-benefits of nature-based climate solutions such as improved air and water quality, enhanced ecosystem services, and community resilience? It looks like maybe Matt dropped off.
No, we didn't spot it.
Okay. Okay.
I'm still here, but
Okay.
I don't know if you can hear me.
Okay, strange to see yourself on the screen. So yes, to reiterate my question, how do we evaluate the co-benefits of nature-based climate solutions such as improved air, water quality, and enhanced ecosystem service and community resilience? Sarah, can I start with you?
So I think it's important to make the distinction between the how do we do this and the do we do this. Because I would argue that most projects on the voluntary market right now, and again, this is the lens that I'm bringing my comments from, don't do this very well. I think a lot of them talk about, the potential implications that the projects will have on air quality and other ecosystem services, but the projects are designed primarily for one ecosystem service, which is carbon storage, and not to monitor the results of any other, what they call co-benefits. So this would be, biodiversity, water quality, air quality. So I think that there's a lot of really important work to be done to think about how we bring these co-benefits into project design a little more explicitly, how we acknowledge potential conflict between carbon storage on a landscape and, say, promoting biodiversity, because they're not always necessarily the same path when you're thinking about short-term carbon gains. And I think, building in space for monitoring of these outcomes, which isn't always embedded in project design, will be key to thinking about how we look at them moving forward. Of course, there are always exceptions to this on the market, and the market's trying to do a good job with bringing in labels that help buyers and project developers to know how they can be embedding these other values into projects. Vera, for example, has CCB. I'm not going to go into the specifics of that, but it's trying very hard to do these things, as are a couple of others. But I think this is a big area for improvement and for general growth in the market, and we're seeing appetite for it. So I think there's room, and I think it's important.
So, is it me?
Yeah.
Context matters. So for example, with reforestation, if you are putting trees in arid drought-strapped locations, you can exacerbate water availability. But if you're putting trees in frequently flooding floodplains, you can actually improve flood mitigation for downstream communities, right? So trees could be awesome for water services or not awesome for water services, depending where you are. So I do think we need increasingly to understand how those things overlap or not. The other point is, I think many people would love to see the ability to optimize along multiple metrics for a single project, right? Like that would be fantastic. But it doesn't always happen, and I think that's okay. That's actually the distinction between natural climate solutions and nature-based solutions for climate. Is that natural climate solutions are really primarily first and foremost to get climate mitigation, but you have to make sure you're not making things worse for biodiversity. It has to be at least neutral. And the argument there is that climate change is a significant threat to biodiversity. So if you are tackling climate change, you are having benefits at a broader, more global scale. That's the argument, at least. I do think the more we can push towards having multiple benefits at the same time, great. But again, that's going to be dependent on the landowner, the communities, to decide what are the actual outcomes that they most want to optimize. And we found often with forest restoration, carbon is secondary. They're more interested in those other benefits too. So it's important to keep them in mind.
Yeah, Matt, if you would like to.
Yes, I think Sarah and Susan did a great job of kind of talking about co-benefits from a project perspective. I can maybe share a little bit of my views looking at it from a corporate perspective of how do you think about nature-based solutions, not only on the carbon impacts and the climate impacts, but broader biodiversity, water, et cetera. So a lot of the work that my team does within Greenhouse Gas Protocol, as I mentioned before, is helping companies understand their footprint and quantify the greenhouse gas impacts. And many times this gets used to report greenhouse gas inventories in the context of setting climate targets to reduce impacts across their value chain. And we see initiatives like the Science-Based Targets Initiative that have actually gained a lot of uptake in the recent years, with some major companies committing to setting targets that are aligned with 1.5C futures. We now see other initiatives out there that are looking to kind of leverage that framework that companies are using to set climate targets, but to apply them across to various other metrics associated with natural climate solutions. So it's called the Science-Based Targets Network, and this is including land hubs and water hub that are trying to help companies understand how can they set targets to reduce other impacts on some of these co-benefits as well, leveraging the kind of framework that has been built around climate. So we're really excited to see some of the pilots that are going on there that are trying to help companies understand how would they report and measure some of these other areas where we see more advancement on some of the water reporting and other things like deforestation free or the land footprint of the company, but other areas such as biodiversity metrics. I think there's a lot of work that still needs to be done to kind of be able to deliver that at scale. But again, that's just one where trying to package this so that you're not just optimizing around climate, like was mentioned by Susan, but really thinking about all of these various indicators as a whole and trying to optimize across the entire system.
Wonderful. Thank you all. I would like to open the floor for questions if anyone in the audience has questions. Yeah, Rich.
Thank you very much, Melissa. You can see the room is full of students, I think mostly graduate students. And I wonder if you could share one or two things that you wish you knew when you were sitting where they're sitting.
So I think, yes, so the question was, this room has many graduate students in it, and is there anything that, we wish we had known when we were students? And I guess my response to that is, now that I have been kind of a professional scientist for some time, I think that being able to clearly communicate is just as important as being a good scientist. And so I would highly recommend that if you're not already seeking out opportunities to communicate your work to broad audiences, either through, periodical publications or speaking opportunities, podcasts, anything. I think it's such a valuable skill. And it's something that I always look for when I'm hiring. I always want to see a writing sample. I always want to see, personal presentation, because it's quite a rare skill and it's incredibly important.
Yes, +1 to science communication, very critical. The other thing I'll say is that I was always a very linear person, and I was like, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do this, I'm going to do my PhD, and I was very afraid. And I guess I'm here to say that it's okay to wander, and it's okay to not know where you're going to end up. I think if you're on the academic track, right, like there's a very clear path that you have to follow. But once you shift out of that, there's so many different jobs that you can do as a scientist, and we need them all, right? We need more scientists working across all different sectors. And once, you can get these diversity of life experiences, learn the soft skills that become important in the business life. And it doesn't have to always be science. Having a more well-rounded, balanced background can actually help you have even greater impact with your science.
Matt, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I can say, like from my own experience, my background coming out of CSU was in greenhouse gas mitigation practices and how do you quantify a lot of that. When I first started working within my greenhouse gas protocol team, there was a lot to learn about corporate reporting and how companies think about their sustainability. Whether you're looking to work for companies to measure the impact, whether you're looking to work for project developers or others who are trying to apply these systems at scale, I would say, making sure that you're trying to reach out to understand those various frameworks and to start to build your network with those people, having informational calls to just better understand that work outside of maybe traditional academic and others that you'd meet on campus is always advisable, and it just helps you kind of understand the broader framework and ecosystem that many professionals work within. And I'll just say that there's a big demand out there by a lot of these companies to try to understand that and to have people who are knowledgeable a lot of these impacts. So just as an encouraging note to some of you who might be hitting the job market soon, trying to find those connections and hopefully land some of those jobs in the near term.
Yeah. No.
Wait, it didn't. The other thing I wanted to add on, so when I was a student, I hated the idea of networking because it just seemed really like slimy to me. Like you're going to talk to people because you want something out of them, right? And I have since learned that that is not what networking is. It's actually just having friends and colleagues and people whose work you're excited to hear more about, and they're excited to tell you about it. And so like, definitely embrace the network, and it's not slimy and it's not scary, and it's amazing the connections that you'll make. So go out and talk to people.
Yeah. And the panelists are people that you can talk to who are in this field. Other questions? Yeah.
I heard a lot. I'm a graduate student, by the way, so thank you for all the advice. My work is research, my research is focused on ecological restoration and indigenous ecological knowledge. And I know I've heard a lot about reforestation. Do you think there's more of a talk like shifting over to like ecological restoration versus just reforestation? When you mentioned some of the issues of like, oftentimes you just do like a monoculture of one type of tree, it actually can be detrimental versus ecological restoring an area. And I'm also wondering your thoughts about working and supporting indigenous communities. I know like worldwide biodiversity seems to be greatest in areas where it's been stewarded by indigenous communities. And I feel like oftentimes when we, especially with like carbon market stuff, when we like try to make up for an area that's been destroyed, it's really not up to the same quality of like doing all the ecosystem services that the area that was destroyed was doing. So yeah, just your thoughts
on. Yes, to everything you said. Well, let's see. I don't know if I can repeat, but I'll try to say it in my responses. So one thing, so I work on reforestation. I love planting trees, but I often find myself sort of saying like, well, it's not just planting trees. Like we should actually be trying to protect intact ecosystems first, because it's very hard to try to regrow systems after the fact. Much more beneficial for biodiversity, carbon cost to keep the natural ecosystem standing. As far as working with indigenous communities, absolutely, yes. At the Nature Conservancy, we have a project that we call the Emerald Edge, which is working along the coast of British Columbia, Oregon, and Washington, and trying to improve forest management practices that the indigenous communities are already doing. And there's great examples, like in the Brazilian Amazon, where when you grant tenure to the indigenous communities, you can actually resist deforestation, measurably resist deforestation, because you've empowered them to actually control the land that they've lived in forever. So yes, I agree with everything that you said.
Thank you for the question. Also, strongly agree with your comments. And just to follow up, I think, from the buy side, we are seeing a lot more interest from corporations in purchasing projects that support both ecological restoration and carbon storage. And I think that we're starting to see a larger number of these projects come online. Back to my previous comments on co-benefits, I think there's a long ways for the market to go. But the most robust projects that we've seen to date are those led by Indigenous communities. I think there are some really good examples, as Susan mentioned, in the Brazilian Amazon. We've seen some really great examples in Oaxaca, Mexico as well as in India. Those are the ones that come to mind right now, but it's definitely gaining momentum on the market from a buy-side perspective.
Yeah. It is 5 o'clock. I want to take just a moment to thank our panelists for all of their invaluable insights into natural climate solutions, nature-based climate solutions, both. So thank you. Thank you. We do have a reception downstairs in the atrium starting now, which 2 of our 3 panelists will be at. Matt, we will miss you. But thank you for joining remotely. I know that that's not always easy as well. So please join us downstairs and you can continue to ask Sarah and Susan questions. And I'm sure that Matt would be willing to field some questions if anybody has additional questions for him. Thank you for your attendance and your thoughtful questions.